Welcome to Perth Property Insider, where you will learn how to grow your wealth and improve your life using Perth Property. Our show is brought to you by Investors Edge Real Estate, the highly rated and award-winning property management, sales and buyers agency servicing the whole of Perth.
How does a buyer's agent prevent you overpaying? I've alluded to this in little parts along the way, but we're always very led by the data and the local feedback from agents in the area as to what's under offer. We're really much looking to where is the price differentials in different pockets of the suburb. We're really looking through to how is the surrounding street at the area level. We want to look at and screen out the negatives that are going to impact price. So you don't want to be directly on bunting onto a school or directly onto a shopping centre. We don't want to have any other sort of major negatives around. We want the streetscape to all be ideally presenting pretty well. Certainly don't want any Homes West houses backing onto the property directly or affecting its perceived value when people come to look at it. Those are the sort of factors we're checking out at an area level. We want to look at what school catchments a property falls into, and is that going to be supportive of extra buyers wanting to come and live in the area to send their kids to that school. That's a great way of keeping buying future demand, because if the school's good, you're going to have a constant demand of families wanting to come into there too. Other factors, we obviously want to make sure that it's not in a flood prone area. We want to make sure it's not in a bushfire prone area, or at least factor that in. If a lot of the suburb is bushfire prone anyway, then that's not. It's only if your particular area's property is, I guess, different to the majority. What we don't want to be buying is something that's different, bad, for the bad reasons. Also want to check out the coding, like I mentioned, see if it has development potential. A lot of people, where they go wrong is that they pay too much for development potential and they haven't yet properly worked out whether the property can be developed or not. I could do a whole episode on assessing development potential, and that might be a good one coming up to do with one of our other subdivision development experts. But you don't want to overpay for development potential if it can't be realised, and you want to make sure that it all stacks up. So that's probably the key things at the area level. Then when we're getting down to the specific property, I've done various episodes on appraising the price of an individual property. You really want to be trying to compare apples with apples as much as possible. So you want to be looking at, what's the living area, what's the age built, what's the condition, the specification, what's the orientation on the property, what's the layout like, what's the level of finish, are things in relatively new or well-maintained condition, or is there likely to be dollars needing to be spent that you need to factor in? How long can you live with the stuff if it's there, or, is it okay to rent out straight away and do some of these upgrades later? Or is there money needed to be spent up front that you need to factor in? Oh boy, I just ran that off my head, a lot of things there. So hopefully they make sense and land for you. But some of the other factors are that bedroom sizes are important, especially depending on, the size of the house. So if you at least want the master bedroom to be a reasonable size. If you're buying a 3-bed, you'd want at least 2 of the bedrooms to be reasonable. Ideally, you'd like built-in robes. Ideally, you'd like an open plan living area, depending on what's typical for the area. Ideally, you'd like the kitchen to be decent and the bathroom to be decent. That's going to attract decent tenants if you're an investor. It's going to make your life so much better if you're a home buyer, or factor in renovating those at some stage. Ideally, you'd like an alfresco or covered back area. Ideally, you'd like a garage or an off-street parking that's covered and secure, ideally to keeping your cars and vehicles. And ideally, you'd like the landscaping and overall, outside areas to be, well-maintained and not needing too much effort. So then obviously when you're looking into a strata property, there's a whole range of other things you need to check out with the body corporate and strata, meeting minutes, financials, the 10-year maintenance plan if there's more than 5 units in the group. And for any property, you really want to be looking at the title to make sure that there's no easement burdens on the property that are going to restrict building. If they're towards the back of the block, say within, the back 2 meters of the property, it's probably not going to be an issue. But if it runs, through the middle of the property or cuts out a big portion of it, you wouldn't want that. You'd want to just make sure that the restrictive covenants, if there are any, are reasonable. It's very normal for covenants to be on a title, especially because they've done it when an estate is created to sort of maintain, the similar look and feel throughout an estate. So nothing usually too much to be worried about there. Many of the covenants expire after a certain year too, so look for an expiry date in them if you're concerned at all. Other things on the title that might give you a bit of a key is if there's a caveat registered against it, it could show that the seller is in a bit of trouble and they've got debtors after them. And I'd also be going into the human side of this negotiation. So we want to find out, why is the owner selling? Why are they selling now? Do they need a quick settlement? What sort of deposit would be attractive to them? Do they need a longer settlement if they haven't found a property? So if you know that they're selling for a certain reason, then you can start to tailor the terms and conditions of the offer to suit them as well. And I think all of this, once you've got your sort of data and your pricing right in your head, once you've set your walkaway price and told someone else about it, you can try to remove emotion from your negotiation. Then that's going to be a real key when using a buyer's agent. They're going to help you with all this. And what I'd also be trying to do, which we do, about 20% of our transactions are off market, where we're leveraging the relationship of the sales agents out there. We're getting off-market access or pre-market access, and then it's great if you don't have competition to worry about. It's just you versus can you find a price that's going to work for the seller, and without having other people bidding against you and being competed off against you. So much harder still to do in a seller's market, much easier to buy off market in a more neutral or buyer's market. But it will start to happen more and more, and about 20% of what we're purchasing at the moment is still in that situation of off market. So we call it our edge network, where we've got buyers agents that we swap off market deals around with, and we've also got sales agents that we've built up relationships with that either let us know before they're putting something on, or let us know an owner that might look at selling if they received an offer. So our edge network's definitely great for getting access to some of those off-market deals.
Yeah, well, one of the best schemes I think we've had in a long time is that first home deposit guarantee scheme. And basically what that is where the federal government steps in and takes on the role of the lender's mortgage insurance company, which, if you don't know, if you're a first home buyer and you haven't got a 20% deposit, you need to pay for lender's mortgage insurance. It's really expensive. Because you're borrowing above 80%, the banks also charge you a higher interest rate. So it's a double whack. You're paying this big fee, which means you need more money to cover those costs, and you're getting charged a higher interest rate. The government coming in and guaranteeing the loan if you have a 5% deposit means you don't pay that fee. And the bank said, well, we've got a government guarantee, so we'll give you the best interest rate as if it was 80%. So you're saving on interest rates, saving on fees. You can borrow more, easier to get into the market with a smaller deposit.
Well, real estate agents love it, and so do sellers too, because if I've got the surety that we're not having to appease a lender's mortgage insurer as well, then it just takes away the uncertainty of the transaction, and I can then, that first home buyer is measuring up a hell of a lot better and on par with an 80% lend borrower.
Exactly right. So I think that has been a really good scheme, and that was brought in by the coalition government when they were in power. Labor continued it, and now going into this latest election, they're extending it. So in Western Australia, we had a property price cap of $600,000, which was great when it first came out. But as you know, the property prices went way above that, and it was now limiting people in Perth to really buying an apartment, and that's not suitable for everybody. That price is going to go up to $850,000, and there was also income band in there that if you earned over $100,000 as a single, you didn't qualify for 125 as a couple. Sorry, it's 125 as a couple, 125 as a single, 150 as a couple. If you were over that, you didn't qualify for it. Apparently, they're getting rid of that income banding altogether, so anybody can apply for that. So I think that will really help. Of course, the danger is what it's going to do is it means there's going to be a lot of first home buyers out there that can potentially borrow up to $850. That's going to push up prices again, isn't it? So, yeah.
And we don't yet know exactly when, but I thought it was early next year that it is coming through, or we're not sure.
No, we're not sure. It's an election promise. I suppose Parliament has to meet, I don't know, and sign off on that at some stage. Hopefully it's soon rather than later, but we haven't got any dates on that. There's also federal government's bringing in their rent to buy, or not rent to buy scheme, but their buyer assistance scheme, where the government owns part of the property, up to 30 or 40% of the property, which means you only need to buy the other percent, 2% deposit. Again, I think in Perth it's going to be an $850,000 property limit in that. Again, that there is a website for it. There's not a lot of details. They're putting that together. There's no commencement date, but all those things are going to roll out and will certainly help the first home buyer. But we're going to see prices jump. So again,
it's like, do you wait for them to come out if you can actually buy? Because there seems to be a bit of a lull. Or do you kind of get in now when you're not competing?
Yeah, well, I think if you can buy now, you jump in before those schemes, because I can see what's going to happen. And that is, whenever they announce these schemes, as prices tend to rise in response to those schemes. So if you are a person that is in a position to buy, start looking now before those schemes push up the prices further. Obviously, if you can't qualify and you're on the road, this could help you, but get in early is my scheme. But have those discussions now. You still need with that deposit guarantee scheme, save 10%. So you need 5% to cover the deposit, and you need 5% to cover the purchase costs. So you need 10%.
All right. Well, how do you think, I guess, buyers and homeowners in Perth measure up compared to around the other capitals? Because we look at affordability and think people are doing it tough out there, but we're still relatively affordable compared to places like Sydney and Brisbane. I guess that's in our favour a bit when we consider that population migration is still going to be continued at the full rates, because Liberals were going to chop it down and reduce it, but I believe Labor's going to keep it strong. So migrants will be assessing, where's most affordable in terms of living, where's the job opportunities, where's housing, affordability. How do you sort of see people weighing up their own household affordability, how much to borrow, sort of in reference to that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've had some conversations with people about this, because I can't work out how Sydney can be so how do they afford it in Sydney, right? And because the prices of properties are so much more and have been so much more for a long time, and their income is less than ours. Perth has really strong income, and in part of that is because we've got such a strong economy, and we have a lot of people working in the mining industry. That happens to be a really big paying role for most people that are in that industry, and they make sacrifices. A lot of people have to do the FIFO gig and all that sort of stuff. So that comes at a cost. But there's a lot more money washing around Perth. The state government is a lot more flush with funds. So doing infrastructure projects and stuff like that, there's a lot more going on. So again, more employment opportunities for those sort of jobs as well. And people working on the roads and the rail, and they're working long hours and they're working weekends and they're working nights, but they're also earning really good money. So there is a lot of money in Perth. But talking to my colleagues on the East Coast, in particularly New South Wales, the sense I get that is in New South Wales is just this real belief and sense and importance of property, that you've got to get into property. Doesn't matter if it's a 1-bedroom flat, that property is where it's at, and people will make sacrifices to own that property. Significant sacrifices. So families will do with one car or no car. They will forego holidays. They will get part-time jobs. So they'll run 2 jobs, do one after work, put one on the weekend, just to get into property. And these are very generalized statements I'm going to be saying here. Everybody's different. Whilst in Western Australia, I think people still really value lifestyle. One of the great attractions of Perth is the lifestyle. It's the climate, it's the beach, it's the weekend, it's holidays, being able to go to Bali or go on a camping trip. A lot of people driving around in very expensive 4 drives and caravan boats and all sorts of these sort of things. We value that. I think we value our lifestyle. So people, often when I'm seeing people and I have a look at them and see what they can borrow, as far as we're talking about these affordability limits at the moment, they're horrified. There's no way they want to borrow that much, because they want to still have that lifestyle. So I think there's still a lot of scope in Perth for growth and people to be able to afford property if that's what they choose to do. And the same applies to property investors on the East Coast. There's a lot of people really aiming to become a property investor. They've researched it. They understand the benefits with the negative gearing and the rental return and all the benefits that come from owning a rental property, and they're prepared to pay that cost to get into it. And I don't No, it seems to be a little bit less on the West Coast. I think it's growing, but I think there's less of that at the moment. So, and as we saw when the eastern states investors swarmed into Perth, I mean, they were like locusts. It was like they came across the Nullarbor like a locust plague. But yeah, hopefully local people can see some of the benefits from that. And if you get the structure right and you buy the right property, the cost after the rental return and after the tax deductions and all the rest of it, there is a cost, but it's not a huge cost. And for the potential growth in the future, which can be significant, it can be costs that really make life-changing differences to people.
Well, on the backdrop of what you mentioned earlier about knowing that rates have turned the corner and they're not likely to keep going up now, but they're more likely to keep going down, I think people can look ahead with a bit more confidence and before it used to be, well, how are we going to manage if things keep going up? Now people can have a bit more confidence and extend a little bit further on the backdrop that things are going to most likely come down and only become more affordable, with rents still increasing in most areas. And so I think that total cost to hold a property, when we say, say if you're borrowing 600K and it's your savings on a 6% loan or something thereabouts, in a year, if you're getting a 1% reduction, that's 6K. If the property was costing you 22K and now all of a sudden it's costing you 15K, that starts to become a lot more manageable, especially if you've got multiple properties. And then if your rents go up another 20 to $50 a week, the gap bridges. So at $50 a week times 52 weeks, you're at another 2,600. So you're down to, more 10 to 12K to hold a property again. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think that does make a massive difference. And as you know, we've seen really strong rental growth, right? So that gap between what it's costing you to hold and what you're paying out each month is shrinking, and that gap between what you're receiving and what you're paying out is also shrinking. So I think that's something that existing investors should be aware of as well, that this rate reduction is across all their loans, of course, so it makes a big difference. And there's some really good deals at the moment. We're talking, owner-occupied rate now, sort of, if you've got a 20% deposit, is sort of, with good lenders, probably starting from about 5.64, 65, somewhere around there. And investor rate's not that much different after this rate reduction, sort of around about the 5.79, 5.8 with some lenders. So pretty low rate. So, the rate I wouldn't call those sort of rates high. We're sort of probably on long-term average rates at the moment. But what has changed, of course, is that people have a lot bigger loans than what they used to have. So we saw the damage, or not damage, but the pain it was inflicting when interest rates were up 0.5 higher than what they were today. And in the 90s, interest rates went 17%. Now, people's loans were so much smaller back then. So, it had a similar feeling recently to what it had back then. So, if we get some more interest rates reductions, I'd be saying again, interest rates are really quite cheap. I've done a loan this week for somebody and they wanted a fixed rate because it sorted their personal requirements, but we fixed it, I think, at 5.19 for 2 years. So, so there are some pretty good rates around at the moment with a downward outlook. So, yes.
That was a very deep and dark cycle for Western Australia. And a lot of the damage, a lot of the problems we have in the building industry at the moment are as a consequence, particularly of what transpired in 2019. The volume of home building, house prices collapsed well below what they should have naturally done because of just a loss of confidence. Once you're 4 or 5 years into a house price decline, what's another year? But it does cause quite a significant amount of damage. What we're on now for Western Australia, yes, that stable employment growth. So in the absence of that capital infrastructure investment, the mining sector employment is continuing to grow. Their investment is continuing to grow year on year and is likely. So the older that capital gets, the increased maintenance and repair that goes into it, and the more people that are employed in maintaining those facilities. So employment base in Western Australia should continue to grow at much more of that 1 to 3% per year. But where there is ongoing employment is in building and construction. So whether it is government expenditure, federal government or state government expenditure in infrastructure, that is certainly quite significant in a number of projects, state significance in Western Australia at the moment. But from a home building perspective, nationally and in Western Australia, we could certainly build homes at capacity without any impact on prices for at least 2 to 3 years. That is, the pent-up demand that exists for homes in WA and nationally will take us 2 to 3 years with zero migration in order to service that. And then when we look at how significant demand is growing, demand for housing comes about from just two factors, and it's population growth and the average number of people per home. And so as we get rising wealth, people want to have fewer people per home, and that rise in employment will see interstate migration and overseas migration continue. And whenever that transpires, there is no time in the next 5 years where we see that the number of homes that are being delivered in any 1 year meets demand in that year. So looking through at least till 2030, every year demand will outstrip supply.
Yeah, well, you touched on population growth there. What's likely to be the projections for Australia, and what sort of share do you think Perth's going to continue to get? We've had a higher than average portion as percentages coming to Perth, I guess, driven by affordability, lifestyle reasons, as well as our low unemployment rate and sheer number of jobs on offer. But what's likely to sort of be the landscape moving forward on that?
Yeah, so the rapid switch that we've seen in population growth, so Perth now has around about 120,000 more people in it than what we would have expected pre-pandemic. So a significant acceleration in that net interstate migration. And there's two factors. There's both the pull and the push factor. And unfortunately, Perth at the moment is losing one of those pull factors, and that is housing affordability. 25% increase in house prices in a 12-month period, 10% over the last year. That's unfortunate. Perth is just about caught up to Brisbane, just 10% below Brisbane now in terms of average house prices. And we can see that that's definitely a benefit for Adelaide at the moment. We can see a different dynamic at play in South Australia pre-pandemic to post-pandemic. And I think, unfortunately, Perth, that erosion, they're certainly nowhere near Sydney prices. But Sydney and Melbourne will continue to push workers out. From a building perspective, they are at a very low level of home building. Sydney is one of the very few areas, Sydney Basin is at a very low level of home building at the moment, will be forcing workers out. In fact, there are more detached homes under construction in Western Australia than there are more homes under construction in Perth at the moment. I'll go again. There are more homes commencing construction in Perth at the moment than there is in Sydney. And that's been sustained for a couple of years and likely to remain the case for the next 2 or 3 years. And so as Sydney pushes workers out, to a lesser extent, Melbourne, because of the cost of housing and because of the slowdown in home building activity, Western Australia, South Australia will be beneficiaries of that. Of course, the lion's share of that skilled trade is going to go to the southeast corner of Queensland. So with those push factors out of Sydney and Melbourne, and with employment growth in Perth likely to remain relatively stable, both from mining and from home building and from construction, then we're looking at the one we're really interested in is not so much international migration, but interstate migration is likely to be sustained at a relatively more stable rate than what we've seen for the past 20 years. So population growth in Western Australia hopefully will remain below that 2% annual population growth. National population growth at the moment is around 1.8%, with the bulk of that going into Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. But with WA drawing workers out of East Coast, a long-term population growth rate of 1.5 to 1.6% is a very rapid population growth rate, and one that's probably likely to be sustained for the rest of this decade.
Okay, interesting. So we've finally got the state election out of the way and the federal election out of the way. No longer seeing politicians' heads everywhere we drive around. What do you think is going to be the impact of the various policies we've ended up with?
Well, Western Australia, of course, is very unique in this situation. It's the one market where, more so than anywhere else, is labour force capacity that is constraining home building activity. So even if the government were to reduce costs, we won't see the volume of homes under construction increase. Now, in terms of federal government policies, there is negligible, nothing, very little at all that is going to impact on the supply of housing nationally or even in Western Australia. Plans to build 40,000 public homes, that's great. We do need more public housing stock, but of course, public housing stock makes up about 3% of supply. And so even at capacity, it's not going to tangibly change that supply and demand equation. It is the other 90% 97% of the market that needs to be unconstrained. And from a federal government perspective, there are very few things they can do. One of the positives that came out of the federal election was all of the talk about infrastructure investment. So Labor Party talking about $10 billion investment in infrastructure, and that's a real positive. That is where the key issue lies. We will be talking about land supply for at least the next decade. And what we can see at the moment is that cost of land is increasing very rapidly. Whether it's for greenfields projects or brownfields projects, it is the major constraint. Now, the federal government subsidising the cost of state government of providing that infrastructure is a positive, but unfortunately in the ALP policy, they also talked about making that contingent upon first home buyers having access to buying that land. Now, I understand from the federal government's perspective, they see that they're subsidising a particular activity and therefore they would like something in return. But we've been through this cycle repeatedly over the past 20 years where a government will step forward and add money to bring development forward and seek something in return. It's effectively the same as saying there's a tax concession on one hand and additional tax on the other. And as a consequence, nothing gets developed. And that has been the underlying problem. And I think they also need to see that they're not subsidising individual households, but in this case, when they're building infrastructure, they are subsidising what is a state government cost of provision of infrastructure. And that goes to one of our core issues, which is, and we talk about who pays to make water flow uphill is the key issue for increasing land supply. And that is, at some point in a development, you have to make water flow uphill. It is a metaphor for all of the other infrastructure that needs to come to bring a new residential, whether it's greenfields or brownfields. It is who pays to make water flow uphill that's the issue. The 1980s, that was a consolidated revenue. It came out of the Department of Main Roads, or Main Works, whichever government department it was at the time. By the 1990s, we'd moved to more of a cost recovery basis or a user pays model. By the year 2000, we'd started to tax that as well. And now in Sydney, it is not just that the person who buys the first home is paying for 100% of the infrastructure up front. They are also paying for the upgrade to infrastructure for downstream users. They're paying for the provision of parks, transport facilities for other, not just their own suburb, but other existing suburbs. They're paying for the maintenance and servicing of that infrastructure in perpetuity, and then they are taxed on the provision of all of those. So they're paying for those people in the 1980s didn't pay any of the cost of that infrastructure, and now somebody that's buying a new house and land package will be paying 150, maybe 200% of the cost of that infrastructure. And it is them subsidising other households that is the issue. If we look at models on how to get through that, South Australia has certainly been one to look at. And just earlier or late last year, the South Australian Premier announced an in principle goal whereby a third of the cost of the infrastructure would be paid for out of consolidated revenue, a third paid for through existing water charges, and a third paid for by developers or therefore passed on to the household that builds the new house and land or new apartment. And that as a model would seem to be a much better model than what we have in certainly Western Australia and every other jurisdiction, desirable goal to work towards.
Yeah, well, that certainly gives me a greater insight into just how complex it is to create this extra land supply and why it's so hard. Yeah.
Yeah, well, the complexity and time. So if we look at Sydney as being the worst case scenario, and there it takes 15 to 20 years to go from a dairy farm through to shovel-ready land, whereas in Adelaide, that's about 4 to 7 years. Now, they're notionally the same dairy farms developed by the same companies, but the same costs, same infrastructure requirements. Just why it costs $600,000 more in Sydney than it does in Adelaide is due to taxes, fees and charges, red tape restrictions. And so that is the key dynamic. And because we've spent 20 years building all of those up, it's very hard to get past that. And talking before about Sydney building fewer homes than Perth, but that is also the state government's goal. Their goal is only to build 22,000 new homes in Sydney, as opposed to Perth building at the moment just over 22,000 homes per year. So however they have such unambitious goals, they will only just manage to achieve them.
I bought a house in Parkwood in about end of 2009. And the great thing with this house is Parkwood, it's one of those suburbs, people don't know it, it's near Willetton. And it was one of these suburbs that was an early, what we call a housing estate now. So they developed it probably around the 70s. They would have released a bunch of land and home buyers would come in, buy their land and build a pretty cookie cutter type of house through whoever the main project builders would have been at the time. So it has a lot of uniformity, and there's basically all the blocks about 700 square meters, and there's two types of houses. There was the 3-bedroom ones and the 4-bedroom ones that were a bit bigger. So what I realized when I was searching was that there was the trick with doing a reno is you need to be able to add enough value to buy it and pay your stamp duty stuff on the way in, pay your selling costs on the way out. That's about, say, 10%. On purchase price, both those combined. Then you've got to do the work to the property, which, about 10% of the purchase price is a rough guide for what a reno would be. And then you've got to hold it. So let's just call that 5% off the top of my head. Then you've got to make some profit. So we're talking like 35, 40% increase in purchase price that you need to sell the thing for. So if you buy it for 500,000, or maybe we can't do that these days. Maybe I'll just say 800,000. You need to bump it up by 40%, which is 4 times 8 is 320. You need to sell for a bit over $1 million to make it worth your while. So those are reasonably significant margins. And what I realized as I was trying to find the project was that if I bought a 3-bedroom place and could turn it by one and could turn it into a 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom, then that would probably give me the margin. And in Parkwood, what was great is because there was this clear formula, it's a very uniform suburb, you should see exactly what the 3x1s were worth and what the 4x2 would be at the end. And I just noticed as I was researching for areas to look at, I looked at the typical prices in that area, and there it was. The margin was there, and there was a property for sale. I went and inspected it, and what was great with this one is that at some point after the house was built, someone decided to extend the house, but they only added more living area. They didn't add any extra bedrooms. So it was the same size as the 4x2 houses, but it was a 3x1. So I bought it for the 3x1 price. And then I did a cosmetic style renovation inside, having to add stud walls and things for a new bathroom and bedroom. And then I had a 4x2 house. So yeah, that was the strategy. What went well was it worked. I made money. I made the money I thought I was going to make. What went wrong was probably, some of the challenges I remember was firstly finding it was a lot harder than I was led to believe. You get geared up to buy a property, do a development, you're really excited, and you start looking, and everything you look at pretty much loses money. And then after a few months to try to figure out what was going wrong, I found some things that made money, but not enough to be worthwhile. And it really made me question, does this even work? And for anyone who might be going through this or wanting to start this journey, yes, it does, but you are looking for a profitable development of any type is a rare thing. So you really need to need to know how to eliminate things that aren't going to work. And so that's how I found this one. As I said, I realized, look, I'm going to need a strategy here that's going to give me this margin, which is going to be add bedroom and bathroom. I need to go through every suburb in my price range and just look at what typical buy prices are, what the typical sell prices are, and figure out which ones probably have a margin there just off market pricing. If I can do that and end up with 5 or 6 suburbs on my list, then all I have to do is wait for the property to come up, which will be, I'll be able to buy at the market price. I'm not trying to do anything too crazy to buy it, and then sell it at the market price, and then it'll work. And that's exactly what happened. And I remember I did it on the weekend. I spent like 2 days going through 50 suburbs, and then it was around the evening. Parkwood came up. I checked what was for sale. The property was there. I went there the next day, and it was the right one. So that was probably the first challenge. And then doing the reno is always hard when you haven't done a reno.
That's not straight cosmetic. Adding a bathroom is still, a fairly decent thing to take on.
Yeah. Look, it was. But the interesting thing, one thing I think has always blessed me with renos is I am not a handy person at all. So I did put a bit of sweat equity into this because I was cash constrained, being my first deal. I can paint, and I can sort of demolish and do the labouring stuff with a bit of help from Dad, and Mum helped me painting. So that was what we could put in. but I've got nothing else. You know, some people can install a kitchen, some people can do a bit of tiling. Not me. It's not what I'm suited to do. I've never wanted to do it. I've never done it, and I never will do it. These days, I pride myself on my house that I need some pictures hung. I'm getting a guy around to do it for me because they'll do a better job. You know, it's all about leaning into what you like and what you're good at, right? So the good thing with that is I couldn't be tempted to bite off more than I could chew. So yes, it was an undertaking, but what does that mean? It actually means just find some good trades, understand, be able to describe to them the scope of work and estimate the cost well. So one thing I did find stressful was cost estimations. Very hard when you've never done it because materials is easy. I'd go to Bunnings and figure that out. But how much does a plumber cost to give you plumbing work for a new bathroom? Very hard to estimate. Even ask the plumber that, and they find it hard. So I had a bit of contingency on this and that. These days, I mainly do it off reference projects. So if you've just done a reno, now you know the cost. So yeah, cost control was hard, and I had a few stressful moments where things were coming in a bit more expensive, and I was a bit short of cash, but I managed to get through it. And yeah, the biggest challenge was probably just the learning curve.
Inflation will certainly eat away at the principal balance. And we just don't want as much interest rate sensitivity as we're willing to stomach during our working life. And then finally, compared to super, owning property, most of us own property in our personal name, which tends to be the best way to own it from a negative gearing perspective and land tax perspective. But owning most of our wealth in our personal name isn't really tax effective, given that each individual can have today up to $2 million in super and not pay any tax whatsoever. So I'm paying capital gains tax outside super, but nil capital gains tax inside super. So really, as property investors approach retirement, we need to start thinking about these things. We want lower gearing, we want more income or more liquidity, and we want to be putting more and more wealth into super. And so what I think most property investors would benefit from is having a bit of a strategy on how they're going to do that. Now, they don't necessarily need to get to 60, stop working, the day after they stop working, go and sell all their assets and put it all in super.
We do see this a bit.
It doesn't have to be that aggressive. You don't need to get it in by the time you're retired or even just a year afterwards. You might take a few years to get it in there, but you want to think about what is the most effective asset allocation for me, what's going to give me predictable levels of income and more predictable levels of growth, particularly now I don't need as much gearing or maybe potentially no gearing, and how do I do that in a manner that's as tax effective as possible? And answering all these questions really invites you to come up with a bit of a longer term strategy, which again brings me back to giving you context for working out, are you on track? So, you know, if a potential client walks into our office tomorrow and they've got $5 million of equity in their property portfolio and not much else, there's a strategy there, right? They've got $5 million of investment assets. They're going to be able to afford to retire, assuming they've got, you know, reasonable expectations. It's really just a case of how we're going to do it. How are we going to shift the chairs on the deck to make sure that they're as tax effective as possible and they can confidently sort of fund retirement. And so I think a lot of property investors, and particularly ones that have been doing it for a long time, and even those just starting out, they need to be thinking about these things. You know, you don't need to have it necessarily perfectly laid out, but just keep in their mind, how will this work? How is investing in property going to help me fund retirement? One of the attractions to putting property inside super is, you know, if you convert into pension phase, you're not going to pay any capital gains tax. And so the capital gains tax disappears. I mean, a lot of people go, well, that's a great outcome. But there's a cost associated with putting money into buying property in super. First one is lower gearing levels, you know, borrow 70 or 80%. So you've got to put in more cash. Interest rates are about 1% or more higher. So you're going to pay more interest over the time. But the big compelling one is negative gearing. So inside super, it pays when in accumulation, it pays a 15% tax rate. Outside super, we pay up to 47%. So you got 3 times more gearing outside super. And we know a $1 saved today is worth a lot more to me than a potential $1 saved in 20 or 30 years' time. And I say potential because, of course, the government keeps changing the rules and moving the goalposts with super. So I don't want to build a strategy that's singly focused on one potential tax outcome necessarily, only to realize in 20 years' time that tax outcome doesn't materialize. So we prefer to, if we're going to have geared investments like property, have them in our personal name. If we're going to make share investments, exhaust super contributions initially, and then if there's anything left over, we can then maybe think about a family trust or something like that. If we're going to buy a property, and this could be a common strategy, buy a property knowing that we will sell it after retirement to reduce debt. And this is particularly for people that are a little bit closer to retirement, might not have the runway to use cash flow to reduce debt. Well, then we might think carefully about it. And we might say, for example, buy 2 in our personal name and 1 in super in that situation, knowing that we're definitely going to sell that property within a shorter period of time. Maybe it's 10 or 15 years, for instance, or even buy a property in a company name can also help you minimize capital gains tax as well. But it all comes back to the strategy, and it's really about, if I can have $2 million in super each, so between, if you've got a spouse, that's $4 million in total. If I've got $4 million of net investment assets at age 60, I want them all inside super. And, saving tax is at a time when you can least afford to pay, or you least want to pay it. I mean, no one really wants to pay it, but certainly not in retirement. It makes a lot of sense to me.
So why is it that 4 million? How did you come up with that again? Is it to do with the thresholds and...
Yeah, 4 million is the transfer, what they call the transfer balance cap, which is indexed. And so if we look out, say 10 years from now, it's probably going to be 2.5 million. But again, the government's, always going to play around with those numbers. I think that the answer, though, is that a certain amount of money inside super is always going to be concessionally taxed. It's always going to have a tax-free component. That's $2 million today. Look, it's possible that's a lower number in 10 years' time. But I think the point I'm trying to get across is a lot of property investors tend to be very focused on property during their working life. And a lot of property investors go through a period of an acquisition stage where they might buy a couple of investment properties, and then they spend the rest of their life making super contributions, but then paying down the debt associated with those properties. And it's a good strategy. It's worked for a lot of people. A lot of people built substantial wealth in property. So I'm not talking people out of doing that. But by the time they get to retirement, it's not a great asset allocation. They've got a lot of liquid assets, a very low income. They're really open to paying higher taxes in retirement, like land tax. And whereas if they had a bit more of a strategy, they get more money into super and it's tax-free, they might realize that actually, I can say if they're in their 50s and they're sitting on a great portfolio, they come up with a strategy to gradually divest of property, in their 60s and get it into super. They might realize they don't need to be investing anymore. Debt reduction isn't that important to them, in which case they might enjoy their 50s a little bit more and spend more on traveling or doing these sorts of things, which kind of circles back to where we started, which is talking about having greater balance.
Okay. So let's say, is there anything else you can add to like how we transition that money in, or is it really going to be case by case? Because I guess you have to consider the other assets that you've already got in super, and if you leave your properties potentially compounding for longer outside before moving them in, there could be advantages to that. So how do you think about the timing? Anything else to say to that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you've got to think about capacity to be able to restructure debt as well, where I find that's something that people can kind of fall foul on. If they take too much debt into retirement, they get into a position where they're locked into a particular structure, and it doesn't give them the flexibility to potentially gradually sell down, rather than needing to sell down in full.
So what you're really saying there is they can't refinance and apply for loans or change that around because they don't have the income anymore to support it. For a PAYG person, that is, if they've got their business still going and they can still show profits, and that's going to be a different discussion, I guess. But
Yep.
That's a big one, and I hadn't really thought about that.
Yeah, a lot of people don't think about it. Really, leading into retirement, or better to say, leading into a situation where you're going to be solely relying on investment income only, you want to be thinking probably at least 5 years out whether you need to do any restructuring. and then how your borrowing capacity works in retirement. But if you have too high loan balances, you'll get locked into a particular lender. So you could end up paying a premium in terms of interest rates, and you'll then be eventually locked into principal interest repayments too as your interest-only term expires. And in that situation, people can be forced into a position of needing to sell a property rather than wanting to sell a property. And that's the other thing too, is that we might come up with a plan to say, okay, in 2028, we're going to sell this property. But we absolutely want flexibility to sell it in 29 or 30 or 31. It might not be a great market to sell it in 28. It might not be the right property, or things change, right? So on one hand, you want to have a really well thought out strategy. On the other hand, that strategy needs to be flexible enough to accommodate the property market, to accommodate lending conditions and these sorts of things. But I think it's just making friends with paying capital gains tax. And it feels like people have an aversion, obviously, to paying it. And I understand, we don't want to, give away half our money to the federal government, but we've got to take a long-term view on this. We've got to take a long-term view on, what are the right assets? What assets are going to give me predictable levels of return so I can enjoy a safe and comfortable retirement? And what is the most tax-effective environment? There's no point paying tax. If you are going to pay tax on investments, then you've got to make sure your after-tax return is just as good, if not better, than what you'd get inside super. And if we look at long-term returns in super, they range between 7 and 10% is a wide range. So you want to be doing really well outside super before tax to be better off. And I think just having a long-term strategy and thinking about that, I think it makes a lot of sense. But the reason I wrote the blog and did the podcast was I think there's a lot of people out there that are sitting on a lot of equity in property. And because the nature of property in that it's negative cash flow, a lot of people then focused on paying down debt or putting money in offset account. And so the shame of that is that they work really hard throughout their entire working life, where they probably could have enjoyed a little bit of better balance had they realised that there is a strategy out there to help them enjoy a comfortable retirement.
Hope today's been valuable for you. If you've enjoyed it, like us and share, subscribe. If you're on YouTube, tell your friends about it. I really appreciate it. And any reviews on iTunes and Spotify are always appreciated. Help the show get found by more people. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you on the next one. Bye.
Just a reminder, the information discussed in this podcast is general in nature. As we don't know your specific situation, you should always seek professional advice before taking any action. For free market reports on your suburbs of interest and other helpful resources to grow your wealth, make sure you join my property investor update at investorsedge.com.au/join. And finally, make sure you're a member of our Perth Property Investment Facebook group to be part of the conversation with other like-minded investors, get help to your questions, and get a feel for what's going on out there in the market. I'll see you in the group.